In the isolated mountains of Appalachia, 1840, where fog clings to valleys like forgotten secrets and communities exist beyond the reach of any law, a tradition exists that outsiders would call barbaric. But for the people of Cutter's Hollow, it's survival. Every autumn, when the leaves turn blood red and the first frost comes early, families gather for what they call the choosing. Young girls, some as young as 11, stand on wooden platforms while men bid on them like livestock. But this isn't a story about an auction. This is about what happens when one girl discovers the real reason behind the choosing, and why the girls who get chosen are never seen again after their first winter. This is the story of Mercy Blackwood, and the night she learned that some traditions aren't meant to keep communities alive. They're meant to feed something much older. There are moments in your life when you realize everything you've been told is a lie. And for me, that moment came on a cold October night in 1840, when I watched my sister climb onto a wooden platform, while men I'd never seen before examined her teeth like she was a horse at market. I was 11 years old, standing in the back of our community hall, with my mother's hand clamped so tight on my shoulder I could feel her fingernails through my dress. And I absolutely knew, that something was wrong with the way those men were looking at Ruth. They weren't looking at her the way men look at women they want to marry. They were looking at her the way my father looked at the hogs before slaughter, calculating weight and quality. And when I turned to ask my mother why their eyes were so strange, so completely black even in the lantern light, she squeezed harder and whispered, "Don't ask questions. Mercy, not tonight." The tradition of the choosing had existed in Cutter's Hollow for as long as anyone could remember, passed down through generations of mountain families who lived so far from civilization that the nearest town was a 3-day journey through forests so thick you could walk for hours and never see the sky. We were told it was practical, that in a community of only 43 families, fresh blood was necessary to prevent the sickness that came from cousins marrying cousins. We were told the men who came each autumn were from settlements deeper in the mountains, places even more remote than ours, and that by offering our daughters to them, we were ensuring the survival of both communities. We were told it was an honor, a sacred duty, and that the girls who were chosen went on to live happy lives as wives and mothers in those distant hollows. But I had counted the years since my cousin Clara was chosen when she was 12, and she would be 17 now, old enough to have children of her own, old enough to perhaps send word or visit during the autumn gathering. None of the chosen girls ever came back, not one, not ever. Ruth stood on the platform in her best dress, the blue one with white flowers that our mother had sewn by candlelight for 3 weeks. And she looked beautiful in the way that terrified me, because I knew what beauty meant in Cutter's Hollow. It meant you were old enough. It meant your turn had come. She was 14, with dark hair that fell to her waist and eyes the color of moss after rain. And when the first man stepped forward to examine her, I saw her hands trembling, even though she kept her face perfectly still, like Mother had taught us. The man was tall, taller than anyone I'd ever seen, with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to fit through doorways. And he wore clothes that seemed wrong somehow, like they were from a different time entirely, all black fabric that didn't move right in the lamplight. He reached up and turned Ruth's face from side to side, pulled back her lips to check her teeth, pressed his fingers against the pulse point in her neck, and the entire time his expression never changed. Blank and clinical as a doctor examining a corpse, there were 5 men that night, and I studied each of them with the intensity of someone trying to memorize faces for a trial, burning their features into my memory, because even at 11 I understood that remembering details might be the only weapon I had. The second man was shorter but wider, with hands like tree roots, and a smell that reminded me of the cellar where we kept the winter meat, salt and copper, and something underneath that made my stomach turn. The third had a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, white against skin that seemed too pale for someone who supposedly lived in the mountains and worked outdoors. The fourth man was younger, maybe only 20, but his eyes were old, ancient even, and when he looked at me standing in the back of the hall, I felt something cold slide down my spine like ice water. The fifth man didn't look at Ruth at all. He stood apart from the others, watching the crowd instead, and I realized with a jolt of fear that he was counting us, his lips moving silently as his gaze moved from family to family. Calculating something I couldn't understand, the bidding started at $20 silver, an enormous sum for people who rarely saw more than a few dollars in a year. And I watched my father's face as the price climbed higher and higher, saw something like relief mixed with shame in his eyes when it reached $50 silver for his daughter, enough to buy seed for spring planting, enough to repair the barn roof before winter, enough to survive another year in these unforgiving mountains. The tall man won with a bid of $73, and when he counted out the coins into my father's hands, I noticed they were old, far older than they should be, worn smooth in ways that suggested they'd been passing from hand to hand for much longer than the 16 years since I'd been born. My father wouldn't look at Ruth as he pocketed the money. He stared at the floor, at his boots, at anything except his daughter standing on that platform with tears running silently down her face. But here's what made me start asking the questions my mother had warned me not to ask. After the tall man claimed Ruth, after the money changed hands and the legal papers were signed by Elder Hutchins, who served as our community's unofficial magistrate, the man did something that broke the pattern of every choosing I'd witnessed in my short life. Instead of taking Ruth's hand and leading her toward the door, instead of making arrangements to return in the morning for the traditional departure ceremony, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small glass vial filled with dark liquid. He uncorked it with his teeth and tilted Ruth's head back, and before my father could even process what was happening, he'd poured the contents down her throat. Ruth's eyes went wide, then unfocused, and her body went limp so quickly that the man had to catch her before she fell. "What did you give her?" my father demanded, and his hand went to the knife at his belt, that old protective instinct finally surfacing too late. The tall man smiled for the first time that night, and his teeth were wrong, too white and too many. "Just something to help her sleep for the journey," he said. "The path to our settlement is long and difficult. Better she doesn't remember the way." And there it was, the first crack in the carefully maintained lie, because why would it matter if she remembered the way? Why would sleep be necessary unless the journey involved something they didn't want the girls to witness or remember? I watched them carry Ruth out into the October darkness, watched the 5 men disappear into the forest with my unconscious sister slung over the tall man's shoulder like a sack of grain, and I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out where they took the girls. I was going to learn the truth about the choosing, and I was going to discover why, in the corner of Elder Hutchins's record book, the one he thought nobody could see when he stood at his podium, next to each chosen girl's name was a single word written in red ink: delivered. The hall emptied slowly after that. Families collecting their coats and children, speaking in hushed voices about the good price Ruth had brought, about how the silver would help so many families make it through the winter. Nobody mentioned the vial. Nobody questioned the way Ruth had collapsed. Nobody asked why the buyer's eyes reflected the lamplight like animals' eyes do in the dark, or why their footsteps had made no sound on the wooden floorboards despite their size and weight. The silence of complicity hung thick in the air, and I understood for the first time that whatever was happening, whatever the choosing really was, everyone knew it wasn't about marriage. They knew, and they did it anyway, and that realization was more terrifying than any monster I could imagine, because monsters you can fight or run from. But what do you do when the monsters are your own parents, your own neighbors, your own community, all agreeing to sacrifice their daughters to something they refuse to name? My mother led me home through darkness so complete it felt solid, and I counted my steps the way I always did, measuring the distance from the hall to our cabin, memorizing the feel of the path under my feet. 347 steps. I'd need to know that number. Behind us, I could hear the other families dispersing. could hear Mrs. Chen sobbing because her daughter Lily had been passed over again. Too small, too sickly, not worth the price. And I thought about how Mrs. Chen's tears were tears of relief, disguised as disappointment. She was grateful her daughter had been rejected, grateful her child got to live another year. When we reached our cabin, my father was already there, sitting at the table with the silver coins spread out in front of him, and he was crying in the way men cry when they think nobody's watching, silent tears running into his beard. My mother sent me to bed without supper, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness of the room I'd shared with Ruth for all 11 years of my life, staring at her empty bed. And I began to plan. The first rule of uncovering secrets in a place like Cutter's Hollow was simple: trust nobody. The second rule was even simpler: assume everyone was lying. I'd learned these rules not from experience but from observation. From watching the way adults exchanged glances when children asked innocent questions, from noticing how certain topics were changed whenever young ears were present. So I started my investigation the way any good spy would, by pretending I'd accepted the official story while gathering every scrap of information I could find. Over the next 3 days, while my mother moved through the house like a ghost and my father disappeared for long hours to work fields that didn't need working, I searched Ruth's belongings for anything that might give me a clue. What I found, tucked inside her old rag doll, was a folded piece of paper covered in Ruth's handwriting. It was a letter she'd never sent, addressed to no one, and it read, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't believe what they tell you about marriage and new settlements. Last month I followed the path the men take into the forest. I found something. And there the letter ended, the sentence unfinished, as if Ruth had been interrupted or had lost her nerve to complete the thought. I held that incomplete letter in my hands and felt something shift inside me, some fundamental understanding that I was now part of a story that had been playing out for generations, that Ruth had tried to warn me and had run out of time. The forest. She'd gone into the forest. She'd seen something. And whatever she'd seen had been terrible enough that she couldn't even finish writing about it. I looked out the window at the tree line, at the massive oaks and pines that surrounded Cutter's Hollow like a fortress wall, and I made my second decision. I would retrace Ruth's path. I would find what she found. And I would do it before the next choosing, before another girl disappeared into those woods, because now I understood something crucial. The choosing wasn't random. It followed a pattern. It happened every autumn when the leaves turned red. It took girls between the ages of 12 and 15, and it had been happening, according to the dates in Elder Hutchins' record book that I'd glimpsed during last year's choosing, for exactly 100 years. 100 autumns. 100 girls, all of them delivered to something in the forest that nobody would name. The thing about living in a community that's built on secrets is that the secrets have architecture, layers of protection designed to keep the truth buried so deep that even thinking about digging feels dangerous. I spent the week after Ruth's disappearance doing what every obedient daughter in Cutter's Hollow was supposed to do. I helped my mother with washing. I tended the kitchen garden. I smiled politely at neighbors who asked how I was managing without my sister, but every moment of compliance was a mask. And behind that mask, I was cataloging inconsistencies, gathering fragments of truth that didn't fit the official narrative. The first fragment came from old Mrs. Brennan, who lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the settlement, and who everyone said had gone peculiar after her twin daughters were chosen in the same year. Back in 1823, I brought her a basket of apples as an excuse to visit, and while she sorted through them with gnarled fingers, she said something that made my blood stop moving. "Your sister had the same eyes as my Sarah did right before they took her. That look of knowing something terrible was coming but being powerless to stop it. Did Ruth tell you what she saw in the forest that night she went wandering?" I nearly dropped the basket. Mrs. Brennan knew. Somehow this supposedly mad old woman knew that Ruth had gone into the forest, had seen something, and the casualness with which she mentioned it suggested this wasn't unusual. that perhaps other girls had tried to uncover the truth before their turns came. I sat down on the floor beside her rocking chair, close enough that she could whisper if she wanted to. And I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I found Ruth's unfinished letter. "What did your daughters see, Mrs. Brennan? What's really out there?" The old woman's hands stopped moving. She stared at the apples in her lap like they contained answers written in their red skins. And when she finally spoke, her voice had changed, become younger somehow, as if she was reaching back through decades to remember who she'd been before grief had hollowed her out. "My Sarah and my Rebecca were 12 when they were chosen. Twins born on the winter solstice, and the men who came for them that year were different from the usual buyers. They wore symbols on their coats, old symbols that my grandmother had once shown me in a book she kept hidden under the floorboards. Symbols that meant offering and covenant and blood price. The night before the choosing, Sarah told me she'd dreamed of a door in the mountain, a door that opened onto nothing, and that she could hear singing coming from the nothing. Voices that weren't quite human but weren't quite anything else either." She paused, and I could see tears forming in her clouded eyes. Could see her struggling with whether to continue, whether telling me these things would save me or doom me. I reached out and took her hand, squeezed it gently. Tried to communicate without words that I needed to know, that I was already too deep into this mystery to turn back now. Mrs. Brennan squeezed back, and then she told me something that would reshape my entire understanding of Cutter's Hollow's history. This settlement wasn't founded by pioneers looking for farmland or freedom from persecution like the stories say. It was founded by 12 families who fled here in 1740 because they'd made a bargain in their previous home, somewhere back east, and that bargain had gone wrong. They came to these mountains because they'd been told there was a place here, a specific hollow where the boundary between our world and something older was thin enough to cross, where they could renegotiate the terms of what they'd promised. And they did renegotiate. They found what they were looking for in these mountains, and they made a new deal, a better deal from their perspective. Instead of being destroyed immediately for breaking their first covenant, they were given 100 years. 100 years of prosperity, of good harvests, of health and safety in these isolated mountains. All they had to do was make regular payments. 1 girl per autumn, 100 payments total. And at the end of that century, the debt would be settled and they'd be free. The room seemed to tilt around me as I processed this information. 100 years. The choosing had been happening for exactly 100 years, which meant this year, 1840, was the final payment. Ruth wasn't just another chosen girl. She was the 100th girl, the last offering. The thought should have brought relief, should have meant that after this autumn the choosing would end and no more daughters would be taken. But Mrs. Brennan's expression told me there was more, something worse. "What happens after the 100th girl?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer, could feel it taking shape in the cold pit of my stomach. The old woman's grip on my hand tightened until it hurt. "That's the question nobody wants to answer, child." My grandmother's book, the one with the symbols, it contained a prophecy or a warning. I was too young to understand which. It said that the 100 payments were never meant to settle the debt. They were meant to feed something, to make it strong enough to cross over completely. And when the 100th girl is delivered, when the covenant is fulfilled, the door in the mountain opens permanently, and what's been waiting on the other side finally gets to come through. I pulled my hand away, stood up so fast the room spun, and I had to grab the back of her rocking chair to steady myself. If what Mrs. Brennan was saying was true, if the 100 girls hadn't been payments but food, then Ruth wasn't just lost, she was bait. The final piece of nourishment for something that had been growing stronger with each autumn's offering, something that was now ready to emerge. And everyone in Cutter's Hollow, all 43 families, all the parents who'd surrendered their daughters, and the elders who'd orchestrated the choosing, and the neighbors who'd pretended it was normal, they were all complicit in feeding this thing, in making it powerful enough to destroy us. I thought about my father's silver coins, and thought about how the price had been climbing higher each year. And I understood with horrible clarity that the men who came to buy the girls weren't from distant settlements at all. They were servants of whatever waited behind that door in the mountain, and the increasing prices weren't about supply and demand. They were about urgency, about something approaching culmination, about a hunger that grew more desperate as it approached satisfaction. See, much like her great-great-grandmother Judith, always asking questions, always digging where she shouldn't, we need to move up her choosing. Take her next autumn when she turns 12, before she causes problems. I stopped breathing. They were talking about me, planning to deliver me next year, to make me the first offering of a new century, a new covenant. And my father who'd cried over his silver coins, who I'd thought felt at least some guilt about selling Ruth, was nodding. I could hear the agreement in his silence, could picture him standing there in the main hall with his hat in his hands, accepting that both his daughters would be fed to whatever waited behind the door in the mountain. What about the books? Elder Hutchins asked. Did you check the storage room like I asked? I could have sworn I felt someone in the hall yesterday. Some disturbance. I pressed myself deeper into the gap between the shelves, made myself small, held the stolen books against my chest, and prayed to a God I wasn't sure existed anymore that they wouldn't find me. I heard the storage room door open, heard Elder Hutchins's heavy tread on the wooden floor, heard him moving through the small space, checking for signs of intrusion. He paused beside the desk where the books had been, and I knew he was looking at the empty space, knew he was realizing something was missing. "John!" he called out, and his voice had changed, become sharp with alarm. "The registry is gone, and the original covenant book. Someone's been here. Someone took them." My father appeared in the doorway, and through the tiny gap in the shelves I could see his face, could see the fear blooming there as he understood what this meant. "Who would dare?" he whispered. Who in the hollow would risk? He stopped mid-sentence, and I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. "Mercy," he said. "It has to be Mercy. She's been acting strange all week, asking her mother questions about the old days, about how the settlement was founded. God help us, she knows." They both stood there in the storage room that was also my hiding place, and I could feel them thinking, calculating, trying to decide what to do about me. Finally, Elder Hutchins spoke, and his words were a death sentence dressed up as pragmatism. "We can't wait until next autumn. She'll have time to spread what she's learned, time to contaminate the other children with doubt. We need to deliver her early. Contact the servants of the covenant. Tell them we have an emergency offering, a Blackwood girl who carries the original line in her veins. They'll pay extra for that. They always do." My father made a sound like a wounded animal, but he didn't argue, didn't protest, and I understood in that moment that I'd lost him, that whatever person he'd been before the covenant had hollowed him out and replaced him with something that could calculate the value of his own children in silver coins. They left the storage room together, left the hall, left me hiding between shelves with books pressed against my racing heart, and a new understanding of exactly how little time I had. Not 3 weeks. Not 3 days until the new moon. I had maybe hours before they came for me, before they drugged me the way they drugged Ruth and carried me into the forest to be delivered early, delivered before I could cause problems, delivered to become the first offering of the next 100 years. I waited until I couldn't hear their footsteps anymore, until the hall was silent except for the settling sounds of old wood. And then I climbed out of my hiding place and ran. I didn't go home. Home wasn't safe anymore. Hadn't been safe since the moment my father agreed to sell Ruth, since the moment he'd nodded along with Elder Hutchins's plan to take me too. I ran to the only place I could think of, the only person who might help me now that I knew the full extent of the conspiracy. I ran to Mrs. Brennan's cabin at the edge of the settlement, the book still clutched under my dress. And when I burst through her door without knocking, she took one look at my face and said, "They know. They're coming for you." I nodded, unable to speak through my gasping breaths. She moved faster than any 78-year-old woman should be able to move, pulling supplies from cupboards and shelves, dried food. A water skin, a heavy wool blanket, an iron knife so old its handle was worn smooth. "You can't wait for the new moon," she said as she packed everything into a canvas bag. "You have to go now. Right now. Follow the map. Find the door." "And Mercy?" She grabbed my shoulders and looked into my eyes with an intensity that seemed to burn. "When you find your sister, when you see what they've done to her, remember that she's still in there somewhere. Don't give up on her." "I gave up on my girls." "I let them go. I thought it was too late. Don't make my mistake." The forest at the edge of Cutter's Hollow had always been a place of whispered warnings and childhood fears, a boundary we were taught never to cross after dark. But as I stood at the tree line, with Mrs. Brennan's canvas bag slung over my shoulder and the stolen books tucked inside my dress, I realized those warnings had never been about protecting us from the forest. They'd been about protecting the forest's secrets from us. The map I'd copied from Mrs. Brennan's memory showed a path that began at a specific point, marked by 3 stones stacked in a cairn, and I found it exactly where she'd said it would be, just north of where the settlement's eastern boundary met the woods. The stones were old, covered in moss and lichen, and carved into the topmost stone was that same symbol I'd seen beside the Blackwood names in the registry. A circle with a line through it, bisected by a cross. I touched it with my fingertips and felt something shift in the air around me, like I'd just opened a door that had been waiting for someone with my particular bloodline to turn the handle. The path itself was barely visible, more of an impression in the undergrowth than an actual trail, and it led upward at an angle that seemed wrong. Too steep for the gentle slope of the mountain I'd always known. I'd grown up in these mountains, had hiked and hunted and gathered herbs in every direction from the settlement. But this path was new to me, or maybe it had always been hidden, revealed only to those who knew exactly where to look. I walked quickly, glancing behind me every few minutes to see if Elder Hutchins or my father had discovered my absence yet, if they were organizing a search party or worse, contacting the Covenant's servants to come collect their emergency offering. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, creating pools of golden light that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, but all I could think about was reaching the door before nightfall, before the darkness made the forest even more treacherous than it already was. According to Mrs. Brennan's map, the first landmark was a creek that ran uphill, defying the natural laws of gravity and water flow, and I found it after maybe an hour of walking. The creek was narrow, no wider than my arm was long, and its water was absolutely clear, so clear I could see every pebble on its bed, every detail of the rocks it flowed over. And it was indeed flowing upward, moving against gravity in a way that made my eyes hurt to watch, as if reality itself was bent wrong in this part of the forest. I knelt beside it and cupped some water in my hands, brought it to my lips before I thought better of it, and the moment the liquid touched my tongue, I spat it out. It tasted like metal and medicine, and something underneath that reminded me of the smell in our cellar where we kept the winter meat. This wasn't water from any normal spring. This was something else, something that had been changed by proximity to whatever power operated behind the door in the mountain. I followed the creek upward, using it as my guide, and the forest around me began to change in subtle ways that accumulated into something deeply unsettling. The trees grew closer together, their trunks wider than any I'd seen before, and their bark had a texture that seemed almost organic, almost like skin stretched over muscle. The birds that had been singing when I first entered the forest had gone silent, and the only sounds now were my footsteps on the leaf-covered ground and the backwards flowing creek bubbling beside me. The light changed too, becoming thicker somehow, more golden but also more oppressive, and I realized the sun should be lower by now, should be approaching the horizon, but instead it seemed frozen at the same angle it had been when I entered the forest. Time was doing something strange here, moving differently. And if time was broken, what else might be broken in this place where the boundary between worlds was supposedly thin? The second landmark was the grove of white birch trees that never lost their leaves, and when I found it, I understood why Mrs. Brennan had included that detail. In late October, every tree in Appalachia should be either bare or wearing autumn colors. But these birches were covered in leaves so green they seemed to glow, and their white bark was marked with symbols similar to the ones I'd seen on the cairn and in the registry. The symbols seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, shifting and rearranging themselves like living text, and I had the uncomfortable feeling they were describing me, cataloging my presence, reporting to something that I was here, that another Blackwood girl was approaching the door. I walked through the grove quickly, fighting the urge to run, and when I emerged on the far side, I saw smoke rising from somewhere ahead. Thin grey smoke that smelled like burning hair. I slowed down, approached more cautiously, and through the trees I caught my first glimpse of what I'd been searching for and dreading in equal measure. There was a clearing ahead, just as the map had promised, and in the center of the clearing was a structure that made my mind rebel against believing it was real. It wasn't a door in the conventional sense. It was a split in the mountain itself, a vertical crack in the rock face that was perhaps 12 feet tall and 3 feet wide at its widest point. And the edges of the crack were smooth, too smooth, as if they'd been carved or melted rather than formed by natural geological processes. But what made it truly horrifying was what was inside the crack. Instead of more rock, instead of a cave or tunnel, there was nothing, pure nothing. A darkness so complete it seemed to absorb light, seemed to pull at my vision when I looked at it. And from that darkness came sounds that weren't quite music and weren't quite screaming, a combination of both that made me want to cover my ears and run back to the settlement, and standing in front of the door, tending the fire that produced the hair-smelling smoke, was one of the men from the choosing. The short, wide one, with hands like tree roots and that smell of salt and copper. He hadn't seen me yet. I was still hidden in the tree line, still had the advantage of surprise, and I watched him work, trying to understand what he was doing. He was burning something in the fire, feeding it items from a leather satchel, and each time he added something new, the smoke changed color slightly, shifting from gray to green to a purple so dark it was almost black. And each time the smoke changed, the sounds from the door changed too, became more agitated or more pleased. I couldn't tell which. The man was humming as he worked, a tuneless, repetitive sound that matched no melody I'd ever heard, and occasionally he would speak to the door itself, addressing it like a person. "Almost ready now. Almost time. Just 3 more weeks and you can stop pretending. Stop hiding. Come through completely and take what's owed." I needed to get past him, needed to reach the door and somehow get inside to find Ruth. But the clearing was open and exposed, offering no cover except the fire smoke itself. I looked around desperately for another approach and noticed something I'd missed initially. The clearing wasn't empty. There were shapes on the ground, dozens of them, arranged in concentric circles around the door. At first, I thought they were rocks or logs, but as my eyes adjusted to the strange light, I realized they were bodies, girls' bodies. The 100 delivered offerings, all of them lying motionless on the bare earth. And even from this distance, I could see they were breathing, their chests rising and falling in perfect synchronization, like they were all sharing one set of lungs. They were alive. All of them were still alive. And Ruth would be among them, somewhere in those circles of sleeping girls. The realization hit me with such force I nearly cried out. Mrs. Brennan had been right. The girls weren't dead. They were being kept alive, being preserved for something, and that something was scheduled to happen on October 31st at midnight when the door opened fully. I thought about the instructions for closing the door, about how what was delivered must be taken back, and the one who takes back must be of the original line, and I began to understand what I needed to do. I needed to wake Ruth. I needed to remove her from those circles, to break the pattern, to reclaim what my family had delivered. But I couldn't do that with the Covenant's servant standing guard. Couldn't approach the door while he was there burning his terrible offerings and humming his tuneless song. I reached into Mrs. Brennan's canvas bag and pulled out the iron knife she'd given me, felt its weight in my hand, and made a decision that transformed me from a scared 11-year-old girl into something harder, something capable of violence if necessary. I'd never killed anything larger than a chicken before, had never even considered the possibility that I might need to hurt another person. But as I crept around the edge of the clearing, using the trees for cover, approaching the man from behind, I felt that hardness inside me growing, felt it filling all the soft spaces where doubt and fear had lived. This man had helped take Ruth. This man was feeding something that had consumed 100 girls. This man stood between me and my sister, and if removing him was necessary, then I would remove him. I got within 10 feet before he sensed something was wrong. His humming stopped. His head tilted like an animal, catching an unfamiliar scent. And when he turned around, when he saw me standing there with the iron knife in my hand, his face did something that confirmed every horrible suspicion I'd had about the Covenant's servants. It split. His mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open, revealing rows of teeth that went back and back and back like a shark's throat. And his eyes, those eyes that had seemed merely strange in the lamplight of the community hall, began to glow with a sickly yellow phosphorescence. "Blackwood, child," he said, and his voice was wrong too, layered with other voices underneath, as if multiple entities were speaking through the same throat. "You're early. Not scheduled for delivery until next autumn. Did your father grow impatient? Did he offer you up before your time?" I didn't waste breath on answering. I lunged forward with the knife, aiming for his chest, for where his heart should be if he had one, and the blade connected. The iron sank into his flesh with a sound like meat tearing, and he screamed. God, how he screamed! But it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of rage and surprise, as if in all his years of service to the Covenant, no one had ever fought back. Black liquid poured from the wound, thick and viscous like tree sap, and where it hit the ground, the grass died instantly, shriveled and turned grey. The man staggered backward, clutching at the knife still embedded in his chest, and his face cycled through a dozen different expressions in rapid succession, like he was trying to decide which emotion was appropriate for this unprecedented situation. Finally, he settled on something that might have been admiration. "Original line," he gasped, and more black liquid bubbled from his mouth. "Strong blood. Fighting blood. The door will like you, will keep you awake longer than the others before it takes what it needs." He pulled the iron knife from his chest and looked at it with something like respect. "This won't kill me, girl. Can't kill what was never properly alive. But it hurts. Oh yes, it hurts. Been centuries since I felt anything like this." He dropped the knife on the ground between us and smiled with that too wide mouth. "Run along now. Go wake your sister. Try to take her back. It won't work. Nothing can break the Covenant once delivery is made, but it will be entertaining to watch you try. And when you fail, when October 31st comes and the door opens fully, you'll understand that what we've given those 100 girls is a gift. They get to be part of something magnificent. They get to fuel the crossing. They get to become the bridge." I grabbed the knife from where he'd dropped it, and this time I aimed for his throat, for the place where his voice came from, and I cut deep. More black liquid sprayed across my dress, across my hands, and the man's smile faltered. He made a gurgling sound and collapsed onto the ground beside his fire, and I didn't wait to see if he would get up again. I ran toward the circles of sleeping girls, toward the bodies arranged in their precise pattern around the door, and I started searching for Ruth. The first circle contained the oldest offerings, girls who'd been delivered decades ago, and they looked wrong in ways I couldn't fully process. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality, like I could almost see through to the bones beneath, and their hair had grown impossibly long, spreading out around them on the ground like roots seeking water. Their eyes were open but unseeing, staring up at the frozen sun, with pupils so dilated their eyes looked completely black. The second circle was slightly better, the girls more recognizable as human, and the third circle better still. I moved through them quickly, checking faces, looking for Ruth's moss-colored eyes and dark hair. and I found her in the fourth circle, the innermost ring, the place reserved for the most recent offerings. She was lying on her back, with her hands folded across her chest like she'd been posed for burial, and her eyes were closed, her breathing so shallow I had to put my hand on her chest to confirm she was alive. "Ruth," I whispered, shaking her gently. "Ruth, wake up! It's Mercy. I've come to take you home." She didn't respond, didn't even flutter her eyelids. Whatever they'd given her during the choosing, whatever was in that dark vial, it had put her into a sleep so deep that normal stimuli couldn't penetrate it. I looked around frantically for something to wake her with, some way to break whatever spell or drug was keeping her unconscious. And my gaze fell on the backwards flowing creek that ran along one edge of the clearing. Water. Maybe water would work. I ran to the creek, filled my hands with the strange metallic tasting liquid, and ran back to Ruth. I splashed it on her face, across her closed eyes, and for a moment nothing happened. Then her body convulsed, arched off the ground like she'd been struck by lightning, and her eyes snapped open. But they weren't her eyes anymore. They were completely white. No iris, no pupil. Just solid white from edge to edge, and when she opened her mouth to scream, I saw that her tongue had turned black. "Ruth!" I grabbed her shoulders, held her down as she thrashed, and slowly, so slowly, color began to return to her eyes, started at the center, and spread outward like ink, diffusing through water. Her normal moss-green irises emerged from the whiteness, and she focused on my face. And for a second, I saw recognition there, saw my sister looking back at me. But then she spoke, and her voice was layered the same way the Covenant servant's voice had been. Multiple entities speaking through one throat. "Mercy, little sister, you shouldn't be here. You're not ready yet. Not ripe yet. You're supposed to have another year." I shook her harder. "Ruth, fight it. Whatever they did to you, whatever they put inside you, fight it. I'm going to take you back. I'm going to break the covenant and close the door." And she laughed, and it was the saddest sound I'd ever heard, full of knowledge and resignation and something that might have been pity. "You can't take me back. I'm not all here anymore. Part of me is already on the other side. Part of me is feeding the door, making it strong. And when midnight comes on October 31st, the rest of me will cross over too. All of us will." She gestured weakly at the other sleeping girls. "We're not victims, Mercy. We're chosen. We're blessed. We get to be part of the great becoming. We get to witness what happens when boundaries dissolve and the old powers return." I slapped her hard. Hard enough that my palms stung and her head snapped to the side. The multiple voices in her speech faltered, and for just a moment it was only Ruth's voice that said, "It hurts. Everything hurts. And I'm so scared. Please help me. Please make it stop." That was all I needed. That moment of clarity, that proof that my sister was still in there somewhere, trapped inside whatever transformation the Covenant was forcing on her. I hooked my arms under her shoulders and started dragging her away from the circles, away from the door, and immediately everything went wrong. The ground beneath us began to shake. The door in the mountain, that vertical crack of absolute darkness, began to widen, the rock face splitting further with sounds like bones breaking. And from inside the darkness something spoke. Not in words I could understand with my ears, but in concepts that appeared fully formed in my mind. "Return what was taken. Complete the circle. The pattern must not be broken." All around us, the other 99 girls began to wake. Their eyes opened in perfect synchronization, all of them showing that same terrible whiteness, and they sat up as one, turned their heads to look at me with expressions of inhuman curiosity. "She's trying to steal," they said in unison, their voices blending into a chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "She's trying to break the covenant. She doesn't understand." They began to stand, to move toward me, and I pulled Ruth faster, dragged her across the clearing, even as she fought against me, even as her body tried to return to the circles, to the pattern, to the place where she belonged, according to the covenant's terms. I could see the tree line ahead, could see the safety of the forest beyond this clearing where reality was broken and time stood still, and I pulled and pulled and we crossed the threshold. One moment we were in the clearing with the door and the waking girls and the voice in my head, and the next we were under the canopy of normal trees with normal light and normal time, and Ruth went completely limp in my arms. I fell backward, landing hard on the ground with my sister sprawled across me, and I felt something in my chest crack, a rib maybe, or something less physical but equally important, and for several long seconds I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think, could only lie there in the leaves with Ruth's dead weight pressing down on me. Then her eyes closed and her breathing deepened, became more regular, and I realized she'd fallen into natural sleep, the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion rather than enchantment. I didn't let myself rest. I couldn't. Behind us in the clearing, I could hear movement, could hear the 99 remaining girls organizing themselves, preparing to come after us, to retrieve what I'd stolen. I got Ruth into a sitting position, then maneuvered her onto my back the way I used to carry her when we were younger, and she'd fallen asleep in the meadow while collecting wildflowers. She was heavier now, 14 instead of 8, but fear made me strong, and I stood with her weight balanced across my shoulders and started walking. Not back toward Cutter's Hollow. I couldn't go there. Not when my own father had agreed to deliver me early. Not when Elder Hutchins knew I'd stolen the registry, but deeper into the forest, in a direction I'd never explored before. Away from both the settlement and the door, and all the terrible choices that had led to this moment. Night was falling now. The real night that comes when time moves properly, and I could barely see the path ahead. I stumbled over roots and rocks, nearly fell a dozen times, and Ruth's weight grew heavier with each step, until my legs were shaking and my back felt like it would snap. But I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant being found, meant being returned to the circles, meant becoming part of the pattern instead of breaking it. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. Long enough that the moon rose, a thin crescent that gave almost no light, and long enough that Ruth began to stir on my back, to mumble incoherent things about doors and darkness and voices that promised transformation. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take another step, when my vision was narrowing to a tunnel and my legs were giving out beneath me, I saw a light ahead through the trees. Not the golden wrong light of the clearing. Normal orange firelight, warm and flickering, coming from what looked like a cabin window. I didn't let myself hope it was friendly, didn't let myself imagine rescue. But I walked toward it anyway, because it was the only option left. And when I got close enough to see details, I recognized the structure. It was Mrs. Brennan's cabin. Somehow, impossibly, I'd walked in a giant circle, and ended up back at the edge of Cutter's Hollow, back at the only place that might offer sanctuary. I kicked at the door, because my hands were occupied holding Ruth, and Mrs. Brennan opened it immediately, as if she'd been waiting for us. She took one look at my face, at Ruth unconscious on my back, at the black liquid staining my dress, and she nodded like this was exactly what she'd expected. "Bring her inside," she said. "Quickly." "They'll be coming soon." I carried Ruth over the threshold, and Mrs. Brennan shut the door behind us. Then did something I didn't understand. She pulled out a small bag of what looked like salt and poured it in a line across the doorway, then drew symbols in the salt with her finger. The same symbols I'd seen on the cairn and the birch trees and the door itself. "This will hold them for a while," she explained, seeing my confusion. "Not forever, but long enough for us to prepare." I laid Ruth on Mrs. Brennan's bed and collapsed into a chair, every muscle in my body screaming. The old woman brought me water, normal water, not the metallic creek water, and I drank it gratefully, and only then did I start to shake, the adrenaline draining away and leaving me hollow and terrified. "I took her back," I said. "I pulled her out of the circles. I broke the pattern, just buildings going about their daily routines, and from this distance everything looked normal, peaceful, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The covenant was broken, the door was closed, and we were bringing back the evidence of a century's worth of crimes. We descended into the valley as the sun was setting on the third day, and the first person to notice our approach was a child, couldn't have been more than 6 years old, who'd been playing near the edge of the settlement. She saw the procession of women emerging from the forest, and she screamed, a high piercing sound of terror. And within minutes, the entire population of Cutter's Hollow had gathered, standing in a loose semicircle and staring at us like we were ghosts or demons, or divine punishment made manifest. I recognized my father in the crowd, saw him go pale when he spotted Ruth and me at the front of the procession, saw him take an involuntary step backward like he wanted to run. Elder Hutchins was there too, his face cycling through confusion and recognition and finally settling on a kind of resigned horror as he counted the women, as he realized what he was seeing. 99 delivered girls, all returned, all freed, all ready to testify about what had been done to them. "It's not possible," Elder Hutchins said, his voice carrying across the space between us. "The covenant can't be broken. The door can't be closed. You're supposed to be gone, delivered, part of the pattern.
How
are you here?" I stepped forward, separating myself from the group of freed women, and I felt every eye in Cutter's Hollow focus on me, felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure. "The covenant is broken," I said, and my voice sounded stronger than I felt, harder. "The door is closed. And these women, your daughters, your sisters, your neighbors who you sold for prosperity and protection, they're all free now, all of them. Because I walked through that door as a willing sacrifice, and the first ones couldn't process what that meant. They choked on forgiveness. They collapsed, trying to digest the idea that someone might choose to die for another person, instead of being coerced into it." The crowd's reaction was complex, divided, like watching a single organism experience multiple emotions simultaneously. Some people started crying, mothers who recognized daughters they'd delivered decades ago, siblings who'd thought their sisters were gone forever, even a few fathers whose guilt apparently outweighed their relief at not having to face transformation on October 31st. But others looked angry, threatened, like our return was an accusation they weren't ready to answer. And a few, including my own father, just looked terrified, like they understood that broken covenants might have consequences, that the first ones might not accept being cheated of their 100 years of feeding without some kind of retaliation. "What have you done?" my father said, and he was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and hatred. "The covenant was our protection, our guarantee of survival. Without it, we're vulnerable. Without it, the first ones might come anyway, might take everyone instead of just—" He stopped, seemed to realize what he was about to say, but it was too late. "Instead of just your daughters." I finished for him. "Instead of just the girls you were willing to sacrifice to buy yourselves another year of comfort. Is that what you were going to say?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and I saw shame on many faces, but not enough of them, not nearly enough. "The first ones aren't coming," I continued. "The door didn't just close. It collapsed. It destroyed itself, trying to process voluntary sacrifice and forgiveness. Those concepts were poison to it, acid that ate through a century of accumulated power. Whatever was on the other side is still there, still locked away, and it's going to stay there unless someone is stupid enough to try making another covenant, which I assume none of you are planning to do." I looked directly at Elder Hutchins when I said this, and he had the decency to look away, to find something fascinating about his boots. Mrs. Brennan pushed through the crowd then, moving faster than I'd thought possible for a woman her age. And when she saw Sarah and Rebecca among the freed women, when she recognized her daughters, despite the decades of aging they'd undergone in the door's darkness, she made a sound like something breaking inside her chest. She ran to them, gathered them both in her arms, even though they were now nearly as old as she was, and she sobbed with a grief that had been waiting 80 years to be released. "My babies," she kept saying. "My babies, you're home, you're finally home." And watching that reunion, watching a mother reclaim daughters who'd been stolen from her in 1823, I felt something shift in the crowd's mood. The anger faded, replaced by understanding of what had really been lost, what we'd really been paying for our century of prosperity. These weren't just abstract offerings. They were people. They were daughters and sisters and neighbors, and they'd been suffering in unimaginable ways while their families pretended they were happy in distant settlements. Over the next few days, Cutter's Hollow began the long, painful process of reckoning with what it had done, and the freed women became both accusation and testimony, living proof that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away. Some families welcomed their returned daughters with genuine joy and remorse, spent hours listening to their stories, trying to make amends for the unforgivable. But others, including my own father, couldn't face what they'd done, couldn't reconcile the comfortable lies they'd been telling themselves with the horrific reality. My father lasted 2 days before he packed a bag and left in the middle of the night, just disappeared into the mountains without even saying goodbye to Ruth or my mother or me, and good riddance to him. We were better off without a man who could count silver coins while his daughter was being drugged and delivered to ancient powers. My mother stayed, but she became a ghost in our cabin, moving through rooms without speaking, cooking meals she didn't eat, staring at Ruth and me like she was trying to understand what species we belonged to. The biggest change came when Margaret Hutchins, the first delivered girl, the one who'd written her testimony in Mrs. Brennan's grandmother's book, called a community meeting in the hall where the choosings had taken place. Everyone came because nobody dared refuse a woman who'd spent 100 years being slowly consumed while remaining conscious and aware. And when we were all assembled, Margaret stood on the same platform where Ruth had been auctioned, and she spoke with a clarity and authority that made even Elder Hutchins shrink back. "This settlement was founded on a lie," she began, "and that lie has metastasized over a century into something monstrous. You told yourselves that delivering your daughters was necessary for survival, that the prosperity and protection you received justified the sacrifice. But here's the truth you need to hear. The first ones were never going to honor the covenant's end date. October 31st, 1840 wasn't going to be the conclusion of your 100-year bargain. It was going to be the beginning of your eternal servitude. The covenant specified that when the 100th girl was delivered, everyone in Cutter's Hollow would be transformed into vessels, into servants, into guardians of the crossing. You were all going to become what we became, conscious prisoners in your own dissolving bodies, suffering forever to maintain a bridge between worlds. The hall erupted in noise, people shouting questions and denials, but Margaret just stood there waiting for them to exhaust themselves. And eventually the shouting died down into uneasy silence. "Mercy Blackwood saved you," she continued. "This 11-year-old child who had more courage in her little finger than all 43 families combined. She walked through that door knowing she might not return. And she broke a covenant that would have destroyed every person in this settlement. She forgave you your cowardice and your cruelty, and that forgiveness became the weapon that closed the door permanently. So here's what's going to happen now. Cutter's Hollow is going to change. Fundamentally, completely. We're going to tear down this hall where the choosings happened. We're going to burn Elder Hutchins's records. We're going to rename this settlement something that doesn't honor the man who organized the first covenant. And we're going to establish a new tradition every year on the anniversary of the door's closing. We're going to gather and tell the story of what happened here, not to celebrate but to remember, to make sure no future generation ever thinks that sacrificing the vulnerable for the comfort of the powerful is acceptable." Elder Hutchins tried to object, tried to argue that destroying records and changing names was erasing history. But Margaret shut him down with a look that could have curdled milk. "You want to preserve history?" she asked. "Fine, then let's preserve the real history. Let's write down every name of every girl who was delivered. Let's document what was done to us in that darkness. Let's create a memorial that makes people uncomfortable, that forces them to confront the consequences of covenant thinking. You don't get to control the narrative anymore, Hutchins. You don't get to write sanitized versions where everyone did their reluctant best in difficult circumstances. The freed women are the historians now. We'll tell the story, and we'll make sure it's told truthfully. The vote to implement Margaret's changes was unanimous, though I suspected some people only voted yes because they were terrified of what the freed women might do if they refused. And over the following weeks, Cutter's Hollow transformed itself in ways both symbolic and practical. The community hall was dismantled board by board, and the wood was used to build a memorial structure, a circular building with 99 alcoves, one for each freed woman, and in each alcove was carved the story of that particular girl, what had been done to her, how long she'd suffered in the door's darkness. In the center of the memorial was a 100th alcove, and at first I thought it would be empty, a reminder of the girl who hadn't been delivered, the one whose absence had allowed the pattern to break. But instead, Margaret and the other freed women insisted it be dedicated to me, to the girl who'd walked through the door voluntarily and somehow survived. They carved my story into that central alcove, not a heroic version, but the truth, including my fear and my doubts and the moments when I'd almost turned back, and underneath my name they carved a single line. She forgave us when we didn't deserve forgiveness, and in forgiving she set us free. Ruth hated the memorial at first, hated that my alcove was central and prominent when all I'd done was what any decent person would do for their sister, but eventually she came to understand why it mattered. The memorial wasn't about celebrating me. It was about preserving the lesson that voluntary sacrifice born from love was more powerful than a century of coerced offerings born from fear. It was about showing future generations that one person's choice to act with courage and compassion could break patterns that seemed unbreakable, could close doors that seemed permanently open. And it was about making sure that if anyone ever tried to establish another covenant, another system that fed the vulnerable to powers that should remain locked away, there would be a physical reminder of what happened the last time, a warning carved in stone that some bargains aren't worth making regardless of what they promise. The settlement was renamed too, though the process of choosing a new name took months and involved more arguments than I'd thought possible over something as simple as what to call a cluster of cabins in the mountains. Eventually, we settled on Mercy's Hollow, which made me deeply uncomfortable, but which I couldn't argue against without seeming ungrateful for the honor being bestowed. Ruth thought it was hilarious that I'd gone from being an unremarkable 11-year-old to having an entire settlement named after me, and she never missed an opportunity to tease me about it, calling me Your Majesty of the Hollow or Saint Mercy the Perpetually Embarrassed. But underneath the teasing was genuine pride, genuine love, and the knowledge that we'd both been changed by what happened in that forest, been transformed from children into something harder and wiser and sadder than we should have been at our ages. The freed women integrated into the community in various ways, depending on their circumstances. The youngest ones, the girls who'd only been in the door's darkness for a few years, adapted relatively quickly, though they all carried scars that would never fully heal. The older ones, like Margaret and Mrs. Brennan's daughters, struggled more with reintegration because they'd missed so much life, had lost decades to suffering and imprisonment, and the world they returned to was different from the one they'd left. Margaret eventually became the settlement's de facto leader, replacing Elder Hutchins, who resigned in shame and moved to a different hollow where nobody knew his history. And Mrs. Brennan lived just long enough to see her daughters truly settled, to know they'd be okay, before she passed away in her sleep one night with a smile on her face that suggested she'd finally found peace. But here's the thing. Nobody talks about when they tell the story of how Mercy Blackwood closed the door and broke the covenant. I didn't come back unchanged. I didn't walk through that darkness and emerge as the same girl who'd entered. Something happened to me in that space between worlds, something I've never fully explained to anyone, including Ruth, because I don't have words for it. When the door was consuming me, when I was being broken down into component parts, I touched something, or something touched me, a consciousness that was separate from the first ones, separate from the door itself, something that had been trapped in that darkness even longer than the delivered girls. It didn't speak in words or concepts. It communicated through images, through feelings, through direct transfer of knowledge into my mind. And what it showed me was this: the first ones weren't the original inhabitants of the space behind the door. They were invaders, parasites that had infected that between place and turned it into a feeding ground. And the thing that had been there first, the original consciousness, it had been waiting for someone to close the door from the inside, to collapse the structure that the first ones had built. That consciousness had helped me survive, had held onto pieces of me while the first ones tried to consume everything, had kept my core intact until Ruth could pull me back through. And in exchange for that help, it had asked for something, or maybe not asked, but simply taken, because in that space beyond words and consent, taking and asking were the same thing. It had marked me, changed me in ways I'm still discovering. Sometimes I can feel the door, even though it's closed and collapsed and shouldn't exist anymore. I can feel the thin places in the world, the spots where boundaries between realities are permeable, and I know instinctively which ones are dangerous and which ones are just natural weak points. Sometimes I have dreams that aren't dreams, but memories that aren't mine. Glimpses of the first one's history, their hunger, their endless patient waiting for worlds to breach so they can cross and consume. And sometimes, late at night when everyone else is sleeping, I can hear voices whispering in a language I shouldn't understand but do, and they're telling me things about other doors, other covenants, other communities that have made bargains they'll eventually regret. Ruth knows something changed in me, even if she doesn't know the details. She watches me carefully when we're in the forest, notices when I avoid certain areas for no visible reason, sees me wake from nightmares I can't or won't describe. She asked me once, about 6 months after the door closed, if I regretted going through, if I wished I'd found another way to break the covenant that didn't involve sacrificing myself. And I told her the truth, I don't regret it, not for a second. Because 99 women are free who would otherwise still be suffering. Because an entire settlement was saved from transformation into eternal servants. Because the cycle of feeding daughters to ancient powers was permanently broken. But I also don't pretend it didn't cost me something fundamental. I'm not the same Mercy who walked into that forest. I'm not even sure I'm entirely human anymore, or at least not human in the way I used to be. I'm something in between now, something that's touched the darkness and been marked by it, something that can sense the doors and hear the whispers and know when boundaries are thinning. And here's the thing I haven't told anyone, the secret I carry that sometimes makes me wake up screaming, the first ones aren't gone. They're still out there, still hungry, still looking for ways to cross into our reality. Closing one door didn't destroy them. It just forced them to look for other doors, other thin places, other communities desperate or foolish enough to make covenants promising prosperity in exchange for offerings. I can feel them probing at the boundaries of our world, testing for weaknesses, and I absolutely know that someday, somewhere, someone is going to open another door. And when that happens, I'll feel it. The mark the consciousness gave me will activate like a compass pointing toward danger. And I'll have to make a choice, ignore it and let another community repeat Cutter's Hollow's mistakes, or try to stop it, try to close another door before it opens fully, try to be the weapon against covenant thinking that my sacrifice accidentally created. Ruth thinks I'm going to choose to ignore it if it happens. Thinks I've done my part and deserve to live a normal life. But she's wrong. She knows I'm wrong, even if she pretends otherwise. Because the same stubbornness that made me steal those books and track through the forest and walk through the door, that same core of hardness that refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, it's still there. Stronger now, actually, reinforced by everything I experienced in that darkness. So when I feel the next door starting to open, and I will feel it, maybe next year, or maybe in a decade, or maybe when I'm old and grey, I'll go. I'll walk into whatever forest or mountain or hidden place is harbouring that new covenant, and I'll do whatever's necessary to close it before another century of daughters is fed to ancient hunger. Not because I'm a hero, not because I'm particularly brave, but because I know what happens if nobody acts. If everyone just accepts that some people are expendable in the name of prosperity and protection. I know what that acceptance costs, how it metastasizes, how it creates communities built on lies that eventually consume everyone. The story people tell about Mercy Blackwood is that she closed the door and saved Cutters Hollow, and then lived happily ever after with her sister in the renamed settlement. They carved that version into my alcove in the memorial, made it inspiring and conclusive and satisfying. But here's the real ending, the one that doesn't get carved in stone. Mercy Blackwood closed one door and became the person who can feel when others open. She saved one community and became responsible for watching for others that might need saving. She forgave her ancestors' covenant and became the living embodiment of why such covenants must never be made again. And she's 12 years old now, getting older every day, carrying knowledge and responsibility that no child should have to carry, waiting for the moment when the whispers get louder and the boundaries thin, and she has to walk into darkness again. That's the truth. That's what remains. Not a happy ending. Just an ending that leads to another beginning, another choice, another door that might need closing. And I'll be ready. I'll always be ready. Because some patterns need to be broken over and over again. Some fights are never truly finished. Some doors keep trying to open no matter how many times you close them. And someone has to be willing to stand guard, to watch the thin places, to walk through darkness when necessary. To protect people who don't even know they're in danger. That someone is me. That's what I became when I forgave my ancestors and the first ones choked on that forgiveness. I became the door closer, the covenant breaker, the one who watches so others don't have to. And if that sounds lonely and hard and nothing like the fairy tale ending people prefer, well, that's because it is. But it's also necessary. And I've learned that necessary doesn't require happiness or satisfaction or reward. It just requires someone willing to do what needs doing, over and over, for as long as it takes. And I'm willing. I'll always be willing. That's my curse and my purpose and my choice. That's what remains after the door closes and the story ends and real life begins again. Me, watching, waiting, ready,